I'm joined by John Cussans, the MFA course leader at the Ruskin School of Art. He's an artist, writer and researcher, and has most recently written a book called Undead, Uprising, Haiti Horror and the Zombie Complex, which presents the history of Haiti through the chimerical optic of voodoo horror. Me and John originally intended to make this podcast episode entirely about the work of Georges Bataille, but quickly found that we both digressed and spiraled off into many other avenues of philosophic thought, including the work of Nick Land, Mark Fisher, and such topics as zombies and capitalism. Please enjoy. I emailed you about the kind of rough guide that we'd go through, starting with the kind of kitsch, but it gets things rolling, the Hermitix question, which is if you could place 5 philosophers into a room and listen to the conversation, which 5 would it be?
Great. Yeah, it's a good question. I enjoyed thinking about that. And I hope you don't mind. They're not all philosophers. It's thinkers, really. Some are philosophers, some not. But I think a room full of philosophers would get a little bit boring and probably over-conceptual. So I'm going to bring 5 people together. The first is obviously Bataille, because that's who we're talking about. And, of course, whether or not Bataille was a philosopher, some people would say he was. He obviously philosophized and knew a lot about philosophy, but some people definitely wouldn't say he was a philosopher. I'm sure you know that. Yeah. And the other person I'd like to bring in after Georges Bataille is Dutty Boukman, who was the Houngan voodoo priest, reputedly, who was at the ceremony which kickstarted the Haitian Revolution. And his conversation with Bataille would be really important, and it would be also very important for me to know precisely what was going through Boukman's mind when he sacrificed that pig, if it was a pig, at Wakaiman. And his plans to start a revolution. My third person would be Catherine Dunham, who's a dancer, choreographer, anthropologist, writer, who wrote one of the kind of a very important book about Haiti called Island Possessed. She was initiated into voodoo. She also was kind of one of the pioneers of black dance, and I think that she'd be an amazing person to have in the conversation. Due to her own political stance as an African-American woman who, as I said, pioneered the black dance movement in North America, and was a political activist as well later in her life, although all through her life she was pretty active. Then we have an artist who would be Bo Dick, who died recently, who is a First Nations artist and activist and something of a shaman. He's a member of a secret society called the Hamatsa, which is famously, reputedly a cannibal society. And he's, in 2013, he did some very important political actions by breaking a copper at the government buildings in Canada, 2 government buildings, in protest of the Canadian government's refusal to recognise Indigenous treaty rights. So that's 4. And the 5th is the 2 philosophers. And I've cheated a bit because I couldn't decide which one of these 2 people to have in. So I've kind of extended my guest list a bit. The first person, well, in no particular order, is René Girard, who you may know, who's a kind of recently come into kind of more, people are talking about Girard more because of Peter Thiel, who has been singing his praises. Peter Thiel was taught by Girard, and I've been reading Girard for 20 years or so, but never really understood it. And only now that I'm reading once again To Double Business Bound and Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, am I starting to realize how important he was as a philosopher. And the philosophy of Bataille and Girard are so closely aligned, so similar. They're interested in sacrifice and religion. And violence, and yet they seem to very rarely be talked about in the same breath. So my 5th person, on the one side, I've got Girard, depending where our conversation goes. And on the other side is a philosopher, thinker, again, not explicitly a philosopher, but certainly a philosophical thinker and someone who was very familiar with philosophy, is a thinker called Anthony Wilden, who is one of my biggest influences, and he's a massively unsung hero, I think, of thinking around cybernetics and communications. And he wrote 3 books. He's also famously the translator of Lacan, one of the first translators of Lacan. And his 3 books, System and Structure, The Rules of No Game, and Man and Woman, War and Peace, are like these amazing works, which occasionally get referenced in philosophical text and thought, but very rarely. And he kind of disappeared after his last book. And it's been, the last 10, 15 years, I've been hoping he'd reappear and contribute to the debate. But he clearly is someone who seems to have opted out at a certain point from the political debate. But his thinking around systems, cybernetics, information theory, communication is quite dazzling. And I think he'd be very useful to be brought in if we end up going down a cybernetics, informatics path rather than a ritual sacrifice path. So let's see which one we go down.
Yeah.
So sorry for extending the guest list a bit there, but
no, it's fine. I think if there's I think these are fine, because I've asked a few people this question kind of off podcast, and a lot of people's pick is Deleuze and Guattari, and you can have this kind of thing where there's like with Girard and sorry, I forgot the surname there.
Wilden.
Wilden.
Anthony Wilden.
So do you think with those two thinkers there's a connection why you kind of had to have those two and overstep the limit of 5? It's interesting. I think intellectual culture is subject to fashion in quite a pronounced way, and over the last few years, certainly teaching in art schools, Deleuze has dominated. Now, there's nothing wrong with Deleuze. Deleuze is a great philosopher, great thinker. Deleuze has dominated over Deleuze and Guattari. Often people talk about Deleuze when they mean Deleuze and Guattari. I've always thought Guattari is as interesting a figure because of his work at Laborde Clinic, and Guattari was a much bigger influence on my thinking when I was younger than Deleuze. Deleuze was a philosopher's philosopher in some ways. Guattari's work with psychotics and mentally ill patients in Laborde was really much more radical as far as I was concerned. And the idea of setting up alternative communities and counter communities and changing the structure of power within organizations is much more kind of what I was interested in. And so books like Molecular Revolution and Machinic Unconscious were much more radical as far as I was concerned, and tied in really with some of the experiments, social experiments Bataille was interested in. And again, interesting that Deleuze and Guattari rarely ever mentioned Bataille. Bataille was, kind of a persona non grata, I guess, in 60s countercultural and intellectual life in Paris. But like Guattari, Bataille was interested in founding different types of communities, the College of Sociology, Acéphale. He was kind of trying to create other ways of living and being collectively, which has always interested me. So Girard, for instance, writes a scathing attack on Anti-Oedipus in To Double Business Bound, which partly because, Deleuze and Guattari are popular among certain intellectuals, quite rightly so. I think if philosophers are critical of the current dominant trends, they tend to get written out. People like Bachelard, Michel Serres, René Girard, I would put in a similar kind of camp intellectually, in that the dominant leftist discourse of intellectualism in France from the 1960s onwards was kind of dominated by Lacanians and Althusserians, and that's the stuff I was reading. And so you kind of avoided those people who made a distance from that. And as well, Girard has a kind of Christian bent, which is kind of almost anathema to Marxist materialists. So there's the Christian angle. As for Anthony Wilden, it's weird why Anthony Wilden was being written out. One of the first places that I came across Wilden was in Baudrillard's Towards a Critique of the Political Economy of the Sign. I think it was one of Baudrillard's semiotic economic works.
And he mentioned Wilden, but then he's almost not mentioned again. You just don't hear about it. And yet he was the first person to translate Lacan. He has a better understanding of the deep connection between cybernetics and structuralism around the signifier, the sign, the code, the digital. He writes whole sections on the analog and the digital back in 1973. I mean, he was so kind of advanced in his thinking. And he's a kind of proto-feminist. His book, Man and Woman, War and Peace, tried to unpack false binaries, false dualisms. His big thing was avoiding thinking that if you have a kind of oppositions at certain levels of logical reality, that they can be carried right through those different levels. You have to separate the levels out, etc. He's a brilliant thinker, a great educator, developed a concept of guerrilla rhetoric. But something must have happened to him. Something must have happened because he kind of disappeared without trace, and no one talks about him anymore.
Okay. So do you feel that within that room there's a question or overarching theme that you've not necessarily been struggling with, but something that you might be able to find some conclusion from those five meeting up?
Yeah, well, I guess the first pair, Bataille and Dutty Bookman, would be very important because one of the big thoughts in my work, realizations that I think we might talk about later in terms of the Haiti work, was when I was doing my PhD, I was very interested in Bataille's idea that somehow a ritual sacrifice and a secret society performing some ritual sacrifice had the potential to kickstart a revolution. And that seemed implausible to me, but I was very fascinated by the idea that somehow a kind of magical act could somehow be the trigger for some contagious mimetic violence that would be unleashed into society that would overthrow capitalism, to put it in that simple revolutionary sense. It seemed as implausible then as it does now, but through my research, I found out that, in fact, that is one of the legends of the Haitian Revolution, which is what it wasn't overthrowing capitalism, but it was overthrowing white colonial rule and slavery, obviously the plantation economy. That reputedly was begun by a ritual sacrifice, and that formed, the people involved in that formed a pact which committed them to the overthrow of the colonial regime. So, and that's been a kind of guiding idea in my research for a long time. And it turns out, I think, that probably Bataille's notion of acéphale is ultimately indebted to the Wakaiman ceremony that reputedly began the Haitian Revolution through circuitous routes, but certainly he knew about it. And he learnt about it probably through William Seabrook, who wrote The Magic Island, the famous book, first book on Haiti, because Michel Leiris and Bataille were friends with Seabrook. And anyway, it was in his book. So, so what actually happened during that night in Alligator Woods, and what Bookman's thinking was around this ritual sacrifice, and he's a very mysterious character. We don't know if he really existed or not, but he's certainly a legend. And he, I think it's likely he was a real character. Someone was captured by the authorities and executed. Their head was put on a stick and displayed in order to put any other would-be revolutionaries off from following his path. So, I think he probably is a real figure. But what was driving his revolutionary thought at the time is kind of what intrigues me, and whether or not that has anything in common with the kind of thought that was driving Bataille's revolutionary ideas in the 1930s. So that's the conversation I'd like Bataille and Bookman to have. That's a historical and kind of esoteric idea, really. What that their thinking was.
If with that, you're saying Bookman is this extremely kind of almost mythical figure who people aren't sure if he exists or exists in the way that is textual.
Yeah.
Do you not feel that that specific conversation might kind of almost ruin look behind the curtain, so to speak.
No, not at all. I mean, it's interesting because I could have chosen Cecile Fatiman, who was the Mambo, reputedly the Mambo, because during the ceremony there was a Hungan and a Mambo who oversaw the proceedings. Her, having done some research into it, I think the presence of Cecile Fatiman is more questionable than Dutty Boukman. And no, it's really an important question for me as to what the thinking was behind the idea of summoning the African gods through a blood sacrifice. The general myth is that blood sacrifice was a way of communicating with the ancestors and with the gods from Africa. It was a ritual practice that had been suppressed by Christian colonials, and that this was a way of communicating, getting back in touch with ancestral powers and ancestral gods who would facilitate their struggle against slavery. So I just would like to know if that was actually what was going on, or
okay.
You know, and what was actually going on at that ceremony, what actually happened. And I think Boukman would be the best person to answer that.
Okay. There was more. I think
there were more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Bataille, Boukman.
Yeah, Catherine Dunham, who is an interesting figure because she was one of the first Black anthropologists to go to Haiti and to Jamaica. And she was a real pioneer, but she's somehow been written out. It's interesting. Her secretary was Maya Deren at one stage. And when people talk about voodoo and film and dance, they often reach for Maya Deren. Now, Maya Deren would have been a great person to have in the conversation. And in many ways, you know, I think she would be a brilliant person to be involved in this discussion. But I think Catherine Dunham was the original, and in many ways was kind of written out. In some ways, not written out, it's a bit too strong. But she was there first. Maya Deren was her secretary, so Maya Deren learned a lot about voodoo and Haiti through Catherine Dunham. Catherine Dunham also bought a property in Haiti called Habitation Leclerc. And Habitation Leclerc was where Napoleon's, was it his sister, Josephine? Anyway, one of the French nobility lived, and was also one of the places where, when the French tried to retake Haiti from the Haitians, from the slaves, was the habitation of the place where one of the most brutal of the French generals lived. And Dunham took over that place and turned it into an ecological centre in the 1980s. And she's just a really fascinating figure and a very larger-than-life personality. She also became an activist in East St. Louis in the States, working in very impoverished Black communities. She's just got a very rich life, and she was initiated into the second level of voodoo initiation. And she writes very eloquently about her initiation and the consequences of initiation. So, yeah, I think she'd be a great contributor to the discussion.
Okay. So there's an underlying, what I can personally see, an underlying theme there of ritual moving from Bataille and Boukman through to the ritual of African ritual. And then you could arguably say that the Cybernetics and the Girardian mimesis, I believe it's pronounced that way, is also a certain kind of contemporary ritual, wherein it's a kind of virulent strain of almost unconscious ritual. So there's a strange underlying theme there within that room of people attending to the philosophy of control in different ways. At least that's
it's interesting. This word control, it's, it came up the last time I had a discussion with somebody at a podcast, was with Eric Davis, the author of Technosis, and he has this podcast called Expanded Minds. And he very quickly pushed me into this, and we were talking about the Undead Uprising book, around this question of control. And I have to say that control has been a very, very important idea in my head ever since I read William Burroughs. And I listened to your discussion with Xenogoth recently, too. And it's fascinating that at the center of a lot of the debates that and discussions and that I've had and has been a major part of my thinking, and it links very much to Mark and Nick's work, is William Burroughs, his notion of control, especially as laid out in Arpuk is Here, the Mayan control machine. But also this idea of language as a virus, and the notion of a parasite. You know, when you lose control, who gets control? And certainly my interest in possession and voodoo, trance and hypnosis has had to do with, ultimately comes from this question of who controls the subject? Who, you know, how are you controlled? What is remote control? So there's definitely a switch of registers if you went into like cybernetics and the notion of control within cybernetics, self-regulating systems, the role of feedback in self-regulating systems, automation, early robotics, etc., and the figure of the somnambulist, and by extension, the zombie. So there is a strange coincidence of themes running through my interests. One which has to do with the politics and psychopolitics of control, as expressed through William Burroughs, I think most emphatically, and this longer history of control and control at a distance, hypnosis, manipulation. How do you make people do things against their will? This idea of what in the book I call them remotely controlled agents without autonomy. And that has been an ongoing preoccupation. And I think, you know, it's still around. And I think that, you know, perhaps where I differed with Mark and Nick over the years in a complex way that's probably too much to go into, it has to do with addiction and control and how one escapes from potentially the extrinsic controls placed on one by the parasites or alien entities or capital.
Would I be somewhat correct in saying that the difference in opinion there is with Mark and Nick, addiction is taken almost as a somewhat darkly beneficial parasite, which is almost an escape an exit mechanism. Addiction used as an inhuman exit mechanism, wherein actuality, addiction is something that is the controller.
Yeah, I think that's very good. A very precise, relatively precise. I think Nick was certainly, and Nick has changed obviously, but back in the day there was certainly. I think you've laid it out in your recent podcasts and discussions with people that certainly that idea of the parasite is something which helps us defeat our humanity and perhaps get to the other side. Certainly an idea I'd associate with Nick. Mark, less so, though. Mark was certainly seemed to accept the being inhabited by an addictive parasite. He seemed to hang on to that as a critical mode, which I was just always felt that he should, let the parasite go. There's a famous example of Burroughs in his book Ali Smiles when he talks about going through the entire Dianetics program. And he talks about having the parasite lifted. Like the parasite can be removed from the central nervous system. He talks about moving. I moved easily in the soundless medium. Burroughs did think that control and there was, language word viruses could get into the central nervous system and control you against your will. But he also believed that the parasites could be removed. Whereas I think certainly for Nick, there would be no desire to remove the parasite. You would work with the parasite. And, the parasite is you. There's no separation between, the parasites which inhabit your body and the control mechanisms in your cells and a bigger kind of parasitic, matrixial parasite in which we're all cocooned in some metaphoric way.
Okay. I think we'll probably return to many of these things, but perhaps we should make some headway on the work of Georges Bataille. And it's interesting that you actually brought up Michel Serres, who's someone I've recently had a big interest in. And Serre is actually someone who quite practically and quite openly now, people are looking back and realizing that he's always had something to say. Well, quite obviously he's always had something to say, but back almost in his heyday when he was writing a lot, he was placed in a position wherein he kind of couldn't make a mainstream effort of philosophy. He was, I believe he was a teacher of history as opposed to philosophy. And he's almost in this, I might have to double check that, but he's in this category of philosophers along with Schopenhauer, Bataille, who within their work is this very subtle inherent critique of the academy. And I mean, I imagine it's not coincidental that these are the philosophers that are often sidelined and don't appear as much as primary sources. I'm not sure if, how you see that.
Yeah, no, well, it's interesting because I think we're both quite familiar with the thought of neo-reaction, and we'll probably get into that. And what's interesting about that on a personal level is that having read quite a lot around that material, it has revealed something about the dominant discourses of the academy, which I already knew about. I was already familiar, but it's revealed them in a different way than I would have expected. I think I mentioned earlier that, as I understand it, Bachelard, Serre, and Girard, but I think particularly Bachelard, there might be an interview or a discussion between Bachelard and Serre. I'm not sure if I remember this correctly. There's a lot of material in the bucket. And but the intellectual scene of the 1960s and 70s was really dominated by Marxists, particularly Althusser and Althuserianism. And almost all the critical theory that I read since I started art school way back when, from Benjamin onwards, was left-wing critical theory fused with Marxism, fused with psychoanalysis. So Althusser being the kind of pivotal figure there, combining Marx with Lacan. And, that was the dominant discourse. You had to, and I've still got colleagues doing it, fastidiously reading Capital from cover to cover and going back to the, project for a scientific psychology, whatever it was, some classical Freud text, not Totem and Taboo, though, probably not Moses and Monotheism, but still. And that I really understand that the critical discourse can get dominated by a set of axiomatics and kind of theoretical concepts, which are really rooted in a very specific traditions. And anything that goes against the grain of that orthodoxy often gets marginalized, pushed aside. I mean, in many ways, that's what happened to Bataille. He was certainly not considered to be an orthodox Marxist in anybody's imagination. He was kind of wild in terms of that. And I think there's good reason for thinking that. He was also, the fact that Acéphale and some of the work, people like Roger Caillois, their work was definitely flirting with fascism, as, the expression used to go. And also the mysticism and occultism, which was deeply, suspicious amongst left-wing materialists, who I never really felt were really materialists. It's always been a question. I never felt that Marxist dialectical materialism was really materialism. It was like an idealism in the disguise of a materialism. But anyway, so I'm going on a bit there. Apologies. But just to say that I sense that some of the thinkers were marginalized in the French intellectual scene because of their refusal to comply with either Sartrean existentialism or Althusserian Marxism, which were the dominant schools of thought. And it seems that they had a very, very, very powerful influence, in French intellectual life that you simply, if you didn't comply with, you would be marginalized.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So I just did quickly check this as this is being recorded. Serre was the teacher for the history of science. And you were saying about in the 60s in the French philosophical scene there being the classical kind of Marx and Freud. Whereas what else is happening at that time is that there's a big push. Push is the wrong word. A big, almost kind of birth of the philosophy of science. And Sayre was taking his trajectory from Lucretian atomism and physics. And you've also got the birth there of if I'm right in thinking this, of cybernetics, which was also completely marginalized. Again,
that's why Wilder was so important, because he brought cybernetics and structuralism together. He organized a big conference at Johns Hopkins University in America, and I think he brought over Foucault, Lacan, maybe Derrida, but he really tried to bring early phase cybernetics, the kind of Warren McCulloch and Ashby and early cybernetic thinkers, Bateson, and wanted to find out if there was a shared ground between cybernetic thinking and structuralism. And it turned out there really wasn't. Now, I can't reach for the book here, but it's a kind of interesting historical moment. And Wilden certainly pointed out that a lot of structuralism was cybernetically naive and was mistaking things like binaries, self-other, for things like ones and zeros. And this is what he excavates very thoroughly in System and Structure. But, it takes in a lot of philosophy and a lot of engineering and a lot of mathematics, which, again, exceeds my competence. But it was really being hashed out. And I think my sort of sense of often thinking shaped by Freud and Marx when it moves into cybernetics is kind of has very simplistic ideas about the relationship between boundary, limit, line, dualisms and binaries that get confused, and they make for great flights of fancy and great speculation, but don't necessarily really reflect what's actually going on at a systems level.
Okay, so it's kind of a utopianism from a simple binary is kind of doomed to fail, but on paper it's an extremely easy fantasy. But that brings,
something like that.
It brings
like the presence, absence, self, other. These kinds of oppositions and dualisms, which don't necessarily all map out in the same way. They're different types of difference, which Bateson famously said, information is the difference that makes the difference, and the difference between a meta level of the game, etc., etc.
So you were on about the Marxist materialism there. Perhaps you could possibly say a little bit about Bataille's base materialism in relation to what you were saying, how you felt that Marxist materialism isn't a real materialism.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say, This is, again, I'm not, how can I put this? I know about base materialism, and I understand dialectical materialism as a kind of idealism. But this is very much informed by reading a lot of Bataille. And in fact, I reread, following our email conversation, Nick's section in Thirst for Annihilation on the Labyrinth, which is really fascinating in this regard. Nick's reading of Bataille's base materialism is something, very linked to what Bataille called the formless or the informe. And Bataille famously said, to say the universe is formless is to say that it is like a spider or spit. And it's very much kind of in keeping with Nick's understanding of it. And I totally agree with that. There's a kind of a horrific dynamism to matter that is very much linked with Bataille, with the abject forces of the sinister, the left-handed sacred, as he'd call it. And these forces and powers of attraction and repulsion which move through nature aren't reducible to the logics of production and consumption, for instance. But the other thing that's really, and again, I can't precisely give you a succinct example of how these things differ or fluctuate in relationship to each other, but certainly when I read Marx against the grain of Bataille, there is certainly a utilitarianism in Marx that you can find in the discourse, the distinction between the use value and exchange value and the price mechanisms. And this is something that Nick was really aware of. And I think that something in that dynamic of the universal equivalence of exchange value, and that every object is potentially has a price within the market system, and these kind of thoughts certainly have a lot to do with how Nick understood, or perhaps still understands, the dynamism of runaway capitalism. That that kind of the baseline exchange value, the universal equivalent, is something that unleashes something into the economic system, seems significant and value, and a very valuable insight. How that links to Bataille's notion of base material, well, Nick gives his version of it in The Labyrinth. But again, we'd have to go into detail on that. We should read it together sometime.
Yeah, there is. I have actually got it here. There is one interesting quote that I really like from it, where Nick says, "The labyrinth is not an intervention into being, but an infestation of irresolvably complex collapse, replacing being with an illimitable corrosion." Yeah. So this base materialism, is an irresolvable complex collapse, which is, Nick certainly has a way of describing, pure inhuman terror.
Yeah, he's brilliant to see. I mean, that's an absolutely amazing book, and it had a huge impact on anybody who was interested in Bataille in the early 90s. It was incredible. It still remains a masterpiece, really, of kind of literary philosophy. I mean, Nick can say more in a sentence than many people can write in a book, as Nietzsche famously said of himself. And Nick pulls that off. He's such a brilliant writer and brilliant thinker. Whether or not we necessarily agree, I don't think is really the point. It's the message, the affect, the communication. What Nick sought to infect, as Bataille, he felt Bataille was doing. He wanted to infect people with a virulent nihilism, a kind of to realize the horror of the general economy. And in its capacity to rip down the human security system, as he called it. And it's dazzling what he does with Bataille, absolutely dazzling.
And yet I would say that Bataille's virulent nihilism and his attempt at kind of removing the layers of almost ego of this system was more successful than Nick's. Bataille seems more complete, perhaps because it's had longer to almost breed. But Nick actually does kind of admit to the failure of it in I believe it's called a dirty joke, where this impossibility to escape the human security system. All you're really doing is there's a brilliant quote from Levinas, which is, "Humans are the limitrophy of nothing." So it's you're right. We're right on the cliff's edge of nothingness, but I don't think it's really possible to. And I think this is evident in a dirty joke. It's not possible to actually step over. I mean, you could keep looking down it and turn yourself insane, but
yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that keeps coming up, I mean, is this the atheism, the virulent atheism, the anti-humanism and atheism. And, the Sardian kind of, one more step, gentlemen, if you would become Republicans, like the necessary steps to really take materialism truly to its limits or beyond its limits. And what I keep coming back to, and it's a kind of strange thing to return to, perhaps not strange at all, is the kind of Christian death of God. And it's interesting, thinking that the death of God isn't just the Nietzschean version of the death of God. It's also, obviously, if you believe Christ was the incarnation of the Godhead, that, Christ being killed was the death of God. And, I'm sure you're familiar with Schopenhauer and the kind of philosophical implications of that death of God. It's just, and I think for Bataille and for Nick, I mean, there's that section in Thirst for Annihilation called Easter, which kind of rehearses that, God is dead and I killed him. And there's that section in Sponge Space where Jesus is given, there's 3 examples from the Gospels of different versions of, Christ being fed vinegar on a sponge. Quite brilliant. But, there's something about, and Bataille too. I mean, Bataille was a Christian, and then lost his. I mean, he wasn't a Christian. He became a Christian, and then he lost his faith and was constantly trying to, in a way, confront the abyss that one was, encountered in an entirely godless universe where Christ's suffering on the cross was utterly meaningless and led to nothing but a kind of endless abyss in which one was falling forever. And these kinds of thoughts kind of interest me. I'm finding myself more and more drawn to this, the extent to which this Christian eschatology is still somehow coded into Western philosophy in ways that we don't necessarily realize immediately.
Yeah. When I was younger, I used to read a lot of the new atheists who I think now have completely ruined the word atheism, because they take it as kind of an a priori non-existence of God as opposed to a non-belief. So if one is to take the death of God in almost a base materialist way, that completely immanentizes God to the human plane and makes him mortal. And not only that, is he's dead. So then you have this kind of rotting, stinking corpse of God, which is still there and still has to be dealt with, which, throughout Bataille, Nick and further, that corpse of God is still there. So I think almost it's often described as atheology as opposed to atheism, because atheism contemporarily just has kind of a snarky nerd vibe.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was Bataille's term for it, wasn't it? Summa Atheologica was the 3 volumes he was putting together, Experience and Guilty and whatever the third one was, I can't remember now. But yeah, it's interesting. And, in terms of the zombie question, it definitely has, in terms of Haitian folklore and the relationship between African religious beliefs and Christian religious beliefs, and they're coming together. Certainly, the resurrection of Lazarus and also the resurrection of Christ after the crucifixion, deeply tied to myths of zombiedom on some levels in Haiti, for instance. So there are theories of zombie makers, the Bokors, who are capable of creating zombies, having had the secret passed down to them by the guards on the crypt of Christ's body, and that there was a special code that was used to raise the dead that's been passed down to Bokors for generations. So they believe the secret knowledge of zombie making is linked to the resurrection of Christ. These are interesting thoughts, anyway.
So you think they believe the knowledge of resurrection was passed down from. Okay, I'm just trying to kind of.
It's one theory. There's many, and it's not. There isn't like a consensus amongst Hungans and Bokors, as far as I know about. But certainly, this was passed on to an anthropologist who was speaking to someone who claimed to be able to make zombies, and the spell was received from. I guess is it the Garden of Gethsemane? Is that the place where Jesus was buried? I guess that's the place.
My knowledge,
and a Roman soldier who was there at the time. Okay. And that the lineage of Bokors have had that secret knowledge passed on to them for generations.
Oh. Has that had any contemporary readings or study?
No, not that I know of. These are all because it's very much wrapped up in the kind of anthropological esoterica of Haitian Vodun, which remains largely secret. There's been lots of anthropological surveys done, but it still remains quite remote and hard to access. I mean, this is one of the things about Catherine Dunham's book, where she talks about 2 stages of initiation, which rarely gets talked about. But these are just 2 stages, and the initiations go on for much longer. So to get to the levels of knowledge that would be required to really understand how things work, you would have to go through quite a few stages of initiation. And not being initiated means one doesn't have access to that connaissance, as they call it, with a K, the special knowledge. So these are kind of rumors, but I think they're fairly valid.
Also, they're much like with Bataille, if one was to remove the Haitian Voodoo almost myth and anthropology from its natural setting and move it to the academy and analyze it in the what we've already discussed and very much still is the subtly Marxist, I personally would say progressivist academic means of analyzing things. I think that form of analysis would destroy the myth, and it would then probably have to be kind of filtered through the academy, kind of ripping off sections which couldn't mold in and couldn't reduce themselves down enough for kind of acceptable textbook. So perhaps it's best left.
Yeah, there's tons of these sorts of things out there. I think that, I mean, it's the academy is its own thing, and there's all sorts of it's full of custom and habit and ways of doing things and fashions and in groups and out groups. I mean, there's no doubt about it that there are things you can say, things you can't say. I think this is where I agree to some extent with neo-reaction, and they're kind of you can't mention human biodiversity without getting fired. I don't think it's necessarily that bad. I'm sure in some American universities it has got that bad, but certainly it's like the playground's like that too. It's a social scene in which there are things you can say, things you can't, things that are acceptable. People are largely mimetic. They copy. It's easier to fit in than to stand out. It's easy to go with the flow. You're more likely to keep your job. These things are very human, all too human. So I don't necessarily think they're any better or worse in the academy than they are in probably any other profession or other, walk of life. But I think they have a more acute significance precisely because those of us who are involved in intellectual pursuits and activities and critical thought are much more acutely aware of it when it happens, because I expect you feel the same. We kind of expect intellectuals, thinkers to be able to accommodate radically divergent thoughts, philosophical positions, ideas, and to, think about them, grapple with them, consider them, not to simply reject them out of some reflex. But it's not a surprise that people do that. Absolutely not.
Which is precisely what Hermetics, this podcast is about finding those smaller groups which weren't necessarily almost accepted. I think maybe a quick clarification is that the podcast doesn't hate the academy. It's more a recognizing that it's almost this kind of subsuming leviathan that often, because of its absolute authoritative presence, often kind of suffocates smaller things. So it doesn't necessarily hate it. A lot of good has come from it, but also because of the way it is in its authority, other means and methods of study are often kind of frowned upon. Classical case of this would be the academy has taken Freud for its kind of absolute own, and that's Freud and psychoanalysis in general is completely accepted. So Wilhelm Reich is that's almost a no-go.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I read a lot of Reich when I was younger, and I think okay, this is a complex one. We could take the concrete example of Reich, and I think that what I've found is that at different places and at different times and at different institutions and at different historical periods, etc., some things come to the fore which no one was talking about before, which were left to one side, and they suddenly gain momentum and significance many years after they were kind of left for dead in a different context. So it doesn't, to me, feel monolithic in the way it operates. I do agree with you that when things are fashionable within the academy, they become the dominant discourse, and everybody has to follow that particular trend. Otherwise, they don't get funding, they don't get jobs, they don't get whatever it is. But what determines and dictates what happens to be fashionable, relevant, significant at any particular moment in time changes remarkably with history and location. So Freud wasn't accepted, for instance, in the French Academy until, Lacan had to revive Freud. Freud had been largely rejected. So, Marx comes and goes. Writers come in and out of favor. There are certainly some authors and thinkers whose work is, kind of monolithic. But so, I think it's just, I don't feel that, I think it's fashion as much as anything else, intellectual fashion. So, Reich isn't fashionable now, but I could imagine Reich becoming fashionable again. I don't see why not in the academy, under the right circumstances.
Okay. I mean, that's a fair assessment. Is there any direction you wish to move on, or I have a lot of kind of very vague questions which could possibly spiral.
Well, it's interesting. I did have a direction to move on, but I've forgotten what it is right now. So you might have to throw something at me. It came and went a few seconds ago.
Okay. If it comes back, please say. But I mean, one direction we can move from that kind of Western authority is in your book Undead, Uprising. There's this brilliant chart where I'm guessing it's you who drew it or came up with it, where there's a very clear split of the conception of a zombie. So it goes leftwards into 60s and 70s Western reading with what begins what is now still the current kind of common reading of a zombie as just a virulent consumer. But then on the right hand side you have this lesser thing which is almost forgotten of the Voodoo, the original controlled zombie, which is much more kind of laced in magic and sorcery.
Yeah.
But that was the initial beginning of zombies. There's no denying that zombies and Voodoo, or voodoo if you're I believe you say in the book that if it's spelt voodoo as in VOODOO, that merely states that the person who wrote it or said it is kind of ignorant to the history and culture of voodoo.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a very Derridian moment, difference and all that, because it's the same sounding word. You can put an N on it. You can, do what you want with it. The irony, of course, is that no one who actually practices that so-called religion in Haiti refers to it as voodoo. It's very rare. They talk about serving the spirits.
Okay.
But so it's in a way and the voodoo was, in fact, one of many dances that peasants and in Haiti danced during their ceremonies. But it's got a sketchy orthography. But so it doesn't. I don't mind which way you spell it in your head or say it how you want.
So why then was that the dance, the ritual that really became virulent, infected many other places?
Well, the original term that in the English language that was first used was VOUDOUX, Vaudou. And it was Mary de Saint-Marie who wrote this history of Haiti before it was Haiti, Saint-Domingue. And in it, he talked about the religion of the slaves. And he used this term voodoo, and he said that it had something to do with his serpent. And he described a voodoo ritual. It seems like a fairly, historically reasonably accurate, although it's impossible to say what would be accurate under those circumstances. But it became the term that outsiders used to describe the religion practiced by Haitian slaves and, after the revolution, Haitian peasants. on the whole. And so it just became the name that stuck. It was the easiest way to describe that particular religion. Of course, it then accumulated over time a lot of negative connotations, which is why many people are resistant to the spelling VOO, DOO, because that tends to be the way it was spelt when people wanted to simply, in broad brushstrokes, make it into a sinister African atavism that threatened to corrupt the body politic of the Americas. So that's why Haitians and Haitian scholars have wanted to sort of distance themselves from that. So one of the first people to make that distinction was Melville Hertzkovitz, who wrote Life in the Haitian Valley in 1936. He was a Boassian anthropologist, very progressive, wrote about the new Negro. He's very much a kind of, progressive anthropologist. And he was keen to differentiate bad spelling from good spelling, and from fakes like William Seabrook from, authentic anthropologists like himself.
Now that you mention it about the if you think of zombies back, so this is Seabrook is the 30s and 40s. Yeah.
The 20s and
30s. So back then, this notion that the subject could be completely overcome and controlled, especially arising from Africa, that's going to be in complete contrast to the almost Americana original liberty of America at the time. So I'm just kind of realizing that the almost strange irony of the fact that this idea of kind of black magic control over someone's complete agency is one against the American spirit, so to speak, but ironically has become one of the things that American cinema is known for. So they've almost... Do you think that they've bastardized the idea of the zombie?
No, I think you're really on it there. I mean, what I meant in the book by the zombie complex, and the zombie complex, in a way, is quite simple. Is that I think just spell it out. The contemporary idea of the zombie has two kind of polarities to it. One is something completely out of control and voracious and absolutely unreasonable, the apocalyptic cannibal zombie. And on the other pole, you have the person whose will has been taken away from them. They're completely controlled. So it's like out of control, completely controlled. Two very different ideas of what the zombie is. And I think you hit on it there. That's the crucial idea, is that the concept of autonomous agency, free will, the individual, the free subject, was totally repellently contradicted by the image of the possessed dancer or the idea of the zombie. But of course, this is during the plantation era. Human beings were reduced to mere machines, to robotic-like entities whose wills had been absolutely brutally, crushed inside them. They were living a living death. That's what it's like to be a slave. Famously, I was just reminded that Nick re-quoted that line from Blade Runner. That's how it feels to be a slave. That's how it feels to be a slave. And so at the same time that the Western Enlightenment tradition is talking about liberty, talking about universal human rights, the enlightened Kantian subject of freely reasoning and making decisions about its own destiny, that philosophical concept emerged precisely in the context of the complete dehumanization and machinization of human beings who were deemed lower down on the social hierarchy, the racial hierarchy, in fact. And the monstrous aberration of the possessed dancer and the zombic slave were kind of the in-the-face kind of horror of what humans can be. I think that's part of the reason why there was an ever-increasing displacement of the paradoxes internal to the notion of free will and liberty onto the black, who then became the receptacle of all the pre-enlightened kind of fears of being controlled by irrational forces, superstition, mired in moral darkness, etc., etc. There's quite clearly a displacement of all the negative side of human liberty onto blacks. And, the consequences of that, we're still living with.
So it was almost upon finding this thing that is so opposed to what the Americas were building. It's an instantaneous control or be controlled. So America's kind of realized they have this virulent, strange, almost inhuman ritual. So instead of exploring it, they just control those who have it and just kind of eradicate it in any sense. And then I guess actually Romero in the quintessential original zombie horror film Night of the Living Dead, the initial political reading of those zombies was that they were communists. So the America's taken this thing and not only used the idea of it against them in the literal sense of colonial slavery, but then again later has kind of turned it into turned it against its other enemy, which its other enemy, communism. But America at this time sees communism as that thing which turns people also into slaves. So there's quite a strange dynamic there.
Well, it's also it's not just communism that turns people into slaves. It's very importantly fascism and some of the the 1940s zombie films. The idea of the National Socialists. The idea that Hitler was very much the hypnotic. Well, he actually technically did philosophically imagine. His idea was to utilize the unconscious impulses of the masses. And he was the kind of sorcerer's apprentice. I think he was quite conscious. I've been reading some extracts of Mein Kampf. And actually, I'm reading a brilliant book by someone called Denis de Rougemont, who is another one of these philosophers that no one really reads very much, probably because he was a Christian. But he wrote a book called The Devil's Share, where he talks about Hitler as the devil. It's a brilliant book. It's my bedtime reading at the moment. But certainly, Hitler, without wanting to get into that whole thing, but people were aware that you can, and they had been aware since the French Revolution, writers like Gustave Le Bon, which, Hitler was reading as a textbook, the crowd, that, there are ways of using rhetoric to appeal to a kind of the mass mind. And it needed symbols, it needed theatre, it needed, the Wagnerian drama of the Nuremberg rallies, needed flames and torches and banners. And if you get it right, you can make people operate collectively in ways which they might, as an individual, reasoning somehow remote from these forces, say, I'm not going to do that. But of course, it's not easy to not do that when, the entire village is marching through with torches and saying we're going to kill the witch.
Yeah, this has become quite a big part of. I'm sure you're more than likely aware of the work in kind of recent mainstream attention of Professor Jordan Peterson at all.
Yeah, I'm very familiar.
One of the things that he always emphasizes about fascism and about the Nazis is the likelihood of, if you were a citizen of Germany in between 1938 and 45, the likelihood of you being a Nazi is extremely high. So this theatre and this almost unnameable thing. Now we're getting near kind of Land's reading of Capital here, but this unnameable thing which then controls people in retrospect, and almost you could say, in the future I won't get taken by it, or if I was there I wouldn't have got taken by it. But people are saying this almost always being taken by it while they're saying it, because it's kind of almost inescapable.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot going on there. I was, as you were talking, I was imagining, the Haitian slaves who decided to rebel against all odds. And this is why, again, Dutty Bookman and Bwakai Man seems really important to me. Like, when the odds are completely stacked against you and you have very little chance of surviving, but you have to try and overthrow this brutal thing, which is everywhere going to kill you if you look the wrong way. I mean, slavery, the routine. You don't look up, master, when, you get someone's raping your wife. Otherwise, you get strung up. So it's a pretty heavy systematic way of kind of suppressing any potential rebellion. So it's amazing to me that people actually go, you know what, okay, let's do it. And, organize themselves to overthrow that. But I see the oppression, and, the oppression in that situation is as much, it's probably primarily on the side of the slaveholding elites who are like let's say the National Socialists during the final solution, that going along with the flow, swimming with the shoal, when the shoal is, massacring or indirectly subordinating certain people and scapegoating certain people and putting them in prisons or exterminating them, whatever it is, I think we're all capable of doing that. I mean, we're not necessarily even aware that it might be happening, but so I think it's a very human thing to do, and this is why I'm finding Girard very interesting to read, because he reduces the entire kind of human collective down to these very simple mechanisms, which seem, deceptively simple. That, everything begins with mimetic rivalry over a conflict over a chosen object, the thing that two or more people desire. They then become rivals over that thing. Conflicts begin, and they will often spiral into violence over who has the right to the thing that is desired and owned or not. Then when these things get really out of control and social chaos social conflict is rife and endemic and spreading everywhere, a scapegoat needs to be found in order to somehow appease the conflicting parties. And that becomes a thing upon which restores order. And it's an amazing kind of simplistic model. But the more you think about it, you start to see it all over the place. And this is what Girard did. He couldn't stop seeing it once he'd kind of dawned on him. And he read, he sees it in Deleuze and Guattari. He sees the conflict over the big daddy Freud, who never actually went away. Oedipus, let's kill Oedipus, let's kill Freud. But in fact, what you're doing is just resurrecting Freud. We don't get any further from Oedipus by writing anti-Oedipus. Oedipus is installed all the more deeply into the heart of our critical thought, and Freud too. So it's fascinating to read through this. So the reason I'm interested in this is this thing about mimetic violence and copying and imitation, which has always fascinated me. The way in which we are compelled to comply through imitation. It just seems to be a very, very powerful human mechanism, collective human mechanism. And to discomply, to stand out, always, to stick one's neck out, always involves a risk. But it's also, historically, the theory of subcultures is based, on this idea that, someone has to stick their neck out. And the only way that a subculture can emerge is if some people stick their necks out and other people say, you know what, I'm really glad you did that. Next time I'm going to do it. And gradually a countercultural, subcultural movement can emerge. But only if people are willing to stick their necks out, say, you know what, I'm not standing for this. I've got a different opinion. I'm exiting. See ya. And people will follow or not.
Yeah. One thing I would actually argue there that's happening. I do agree with you, but when you say about people sticking their necks out, and that's this kind of node where other people suddenly go, oh yeah, actually I wanted to be or do or see that. Now, thanks to many new, I guess you could even call them cybernetic systems, things like social media, the internet, and just generally kind of the hyper-globalized society, that as soon as someone sticks their neck out now, it's completely subsumed into runaway capital.
Yeah, why? I wonder why. I mean, it's interesting. I need to just check that. In what sense is it subsumed into runaway capital?
Well, I think in a very basic sense, you could go back to subcultures. Initially, would would arise in kind of very localized forms, which are quite split off. So you'd have to do a lot to kind of find them. Maybe you just see some obscure poster, or you'd have to at least, I think, attend to them via analog means. So the meeting up. So they were very much more of a ritual actual physical meeting, quite like Bataille's Akafal. Whereas now what happens when you have kind of globalized systems and things like Amazon and Facebook is the fact that you can instantaneously just attend to any subculture. I think that should now be in quotes, between quotation marks, is that sense of ritual and actual meaning is completely destroyed, because that thing's already being assimilated into a larger system, which is pretty much. I don't want to go off into that channel of everything's just consumerist. I don't want to do that, because these things, I'm sure, might still have a remnant of meaning for people when they're attending to them. But I think that's far more of a virulent strain of what Girard is focusing on there.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it reminds me, this is one of my big differences with Mark, who was a friend and colleague, but his addiction to social media and to mobile devices just seemed, really incredible to me. And his kind of his sort of like melancholy and despair around, the lack of innovation and things are never couldn't be what they were like before. And even Nick, and I agree with Nick's, funny that Facebook slump. In his recent interview, and I really dislike Facebook too. I've never been on Facebook. I really dislike social media, but it's always been this case of the Bartleby moment for me, which is kind of I prefer not to, or just walking out, or just not turning up, and not jigging school, just refusing to go and sit and finding out who's when you in the park smoking a joint when you're supposed to be at school. I don't know if this is a hypothetical example, but, who do you meet?
Yeah.
When you decide to, sod this, people have always done it. Sod this, I'm moving to London. I don't care. I'm moving to Dundee. I'm just going to see what happens. And, people find each other who are breaking free from the normative conventions of everyday life. This continually happens. This isn't something that I think is entirely absorbed by the internet, unless you spend all your time on the internet, in which case it definitely feels like there is no outside, and everything that happens on there is just feeding the machine, feeding runaway capital. But as soon as you turn the machine off and put the phone down and go out, I still, things are happening outside, off the map that, off Google Maps, that occult things happen. There's lots of people doing magic and occult and ritual in strange places, and I come across a lot of strange goings on around and about that aren't in any way channeled through the internet.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting what you've said about Mark Fisher's work there. Mark, because you knew him personally, correct?
Yeah, we knew each other for a long time.
He was quite kind of constantly almost addicted to social media and smartphones and things. Yeah. So do you think that attitude is perhaps hypocritical is an extremely strong word for this, but hypocritical in relation to his capitalist realist movement?
No, I think Mark, it was great with Mark because, I was around Mark and Nick for a long time. I was very close to I was around that whole group when, there was Switch, then there was CCIU got formed, and, I was very close to all of that stuff happening. And there's a big culmination event where CCIU did this event in London, a great event called Syzygy with Orphan Drift, who I was very close to, and I knew the whole crowd. And Syzygy was this really powerful event. I mentioned this idea of the dark Haiti, and that it really, in many ways, was the culmination of it. It's an incredible event. It's where the numogram got invented, the Lemurian time demons, all that kind of work came out of the hyperstition, was around that 1999 moment. And things went pear-shaped. And I don't know if I was the only one, but things went quite pear-shaped after that, especially then there was 9/11, which was a hugely disturbing, traumatic event for lots of people. I don't want to go too far into that, but there was something very pronounced about that for the kind of thought that we were involved in. And I was very happy to see Mark, after a period of what I thought was silence, come back with K-Punk and a kind of renewed Marxism, which I think, he was, Jameson was very important. And it was very refreshing, and I was glad to see it, because I thought everybody had basically been kind of like blitzkrieged, into some sort of like void. And so I was very happy to see Mark come back. So K-Punk was good to see, and he was doing what he'd done before. I was very happy to see. It was like he was back. And then a few years later, Nick was back with Dark Enlightenment. I guess that was around 2011. I can't remember. He started doing that. It was another blog before that. But anyway, it was great to see those things come back. Where am I going with this? I think that, there's something about both Nick and Mark's reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which I part ways with. I used to be a Freudian, I'm not anymore. I'm really, really against Lacan. I think psychoanalysis Lacanianism is a complete trap. And I think that the Althusserian, Marxist, Lacanian axis is super bad emotionally, psychologically. I think it amplifies left-wing melancholia. A lot of my colleagues on the left are so depressed, they've got mental health issues, they're in a real mess, and they keep on reading the same stuff, which just makes them seem absolutely trapped in a diabolical, inescapable machine of capital. So if you're on the left of that just feels like horribly suffocating, and you just feel like you're going insane all the time. And Mark's resistance to, I don't know what his relationship was to antidepressants, but certainly the idea that, depression is significantly caused by capitalism. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think we need to tend to our addictions.
Yeah, there's actually, I can edit any of this out if you kind of want me to. But there's actually a more strangely applicable quote from Will Self when he's talking about the internet, and he says that there's never going to be. So if you're shopping on Amazon, I imagine you have loads and loads of recommendations in your Amazon for books on zombies, and I have loads for anything around kind of land and CCRU, because that's the stuff I've been buying lately. But one of the things Will Self says is there's never going to be a point where Amazon kind of stops you and goes and says, hey, are you sure you want to keep reading this same line? So the internet is a constant kind of recursive feedback loop where you just keep doing the same thing. And this is so the Daniel who emailed you my email. This is both mine and his critique of Mark's thing of Mark's kind of melancholy as well, which I recently wrote about on Twitter as well, between left and right modes of self-improvement, and kind of, I just simply cannot see that capitalism isn't making you do things to your detriment. So, and I think that passing that off and waiting around for a collective is extremely dangerous. But I didn't say this during the chat with Matt, because that was with
Matt. No, and I agree. I mean, I absolutely strongly, and I think that's where I'm sympathetic to Jordan Peterson too. I think what he says is very straightforward and clear. I think a lot of people, my colleagues on the left, as I said, are very depressed. They're suffering from serious mental health problems. They're on and off antidepressants. And I think there are all sorts of reasons why people get depressed and have mental health problems. Social reality is difficult. Life is difficult. There's a lot of problems and things that we have to face. But to blame it on capitalism seems incredible to me. But, it's incredible. But I can understand how you arrive at that. And I think this is where I would have parted ways with Mark. And I kind of wish that, one of the sad things is that, I could never really tell Mark what I really thought, or because we never had the opportunity. Occasionally we'd be on panels together, and I would voice my differences with Mark, but they always happened in a kind of academic context rather than a personal context, which is where I would have rather sat down and said, I see it like this, Mark, let's have a conversation about depression and antidepressants and mental health, and let's have a talk about capitalism, because I have very strong opinions about this that I think might be useful. I'm not saying that, you can never dissuade someone from suicide or taking the path that they take, but it's less to do with Mark and more to do with a whole number of friends I've had, and myself included, who, can be led by a certain idea of capital as this horrible agency, which is there's no escape from. I joke with some of my Marxist friends that they'd say that even the wind can be commodified. There's this idea that all of reality is ultimately commodifiable because of capitalism. It isn't, and it hasn't been, and it won't be, but they act like it already is. So if I look out the window now and I see these clouds and think, actually, they could be a simulation from the future made by some super matrixial capitalist machine, I'm going to feel pretty depressed, and that there's no horizon from which I can escape. But that's just not the case. To get people to see that is it's very hard when people believe in the capital matrix.
Well, they've found an intellectual loop, which because one of the things you'd say there is they see everything as commodified, and you could say to these this just sounds kind of almost rhetoric now, but you could say to these leftists, oh, that's not a very healthy outlook, and then the opinion is, well, the idea of healthy is capitalist. That's that. So then you get in this loop of, so then you have to get down to this kind of objective politics of what's better, kind of, waking up and actually wanting, feeling good or not. And then there's that idea of, maybe being depressed is just a personality which isn't accepted within capitalism. And it's like, oh man, it's so difficult.
Well, it's, of course, I've spent time in Haiti and many other places, but if anyone spent time in Port-au-Prince, and I'm not, it's kind of cliche, a truism, but it's so true. People live without running water, without electricity. They have no health service to speak of, very difficult to get education, unless you've got a degree of wealth that's almost unthinkable. And then when you go to a country like that and you come back to the UK and you go, okay, we've got a health service. We've got everyone can pretty much get education. The banks lend people money; they go into debt. Yeah, I can have a shower every day, pretty much. You're like, this is good. And the idea that one should feel guilty or say that it's only the evil of capitalism that has made it possible for you to have a shower. Now, there is some truth to the fact that technological Western development and capitalism being part of it. I agree, but the idea that we live in some insanely brutal, inhuman, suffocating simulation of reality that prevents us from being well. It's just not. I think it can feel like that for some people, and I don't deny, like anybody who's depressed, it's very real. But it's very important to identify what the real causes are. And I think to point the finger at capitalism is not helping most of my friends on the left who've got mental health problems.
No, yeah, I'm not sure how we got here. We haven't. But yeah, this is one of the things I was recently interviewed about, right accelerationism. We got onto this, and one of the points Jordan Peterson brings up, because it's interesting that you bring up Haiti and the fact they haven't got running water or or electricity. And in my mind, that probably means that their lives are far more simpler in the fact that their daily routine and tasks aren't. My routine and tasks for today were to get up. I trade assets for a living, so look at some screens, work out, and then sort out the notes for this, which to someone from Haiti is so alien, because none of the things I had to do today were primary to my actual survival. So as soon as survival is nowhere near your primary goal, meaning's kind of lost, and you're free to lose your mind in any abstractions you like. So.
And they're certainly not blaming capitalism for that. I mean, a left-wing person might, a Marxist might say, yeah, it's there, but it's just not the case. Haiti is not poor because of capitalism. I mean, it's only poor because of capitalism if you believe, as many Marxists do, which is what's kind of what I feel, and it's interesting that Nick was a Marxist, not really a Marxist, but not a Marxist in terms of, believing in the proletarian revolution, but his philosophical thinking and his thinking about economics is massively informed by capital. And that's his understanding of capitalism, Marxist analysis of capital. And that Marxist analysis of capital, which potentially turns it into an absolutely ineluctable, all-pervasive, unavoidable, inescapable, reality-changing entity, is something that people on the left have of it. Like, they deify it into a god, basically. I mean, that's kind of what it's like the left do with capitalism. They turn capitalism into a god, a bad god, a demiurge. It's like a Manichaeanism, without the Empyrean escape that the Gnostics would have got to. It's that kind of thing. And that's what I think is insane, that people influenced by Marxism and psychoanalysis see the universe as inescapably controlled by capital.
Yes, I agree. The one thing I would say there in reference to Land's work, however, is I think you could say he's taken capital in this as this Marxist in a deification, but I think what Land then does, which is kind of terrifying, is then assimilates that idea into a Lovecraftian cosmic horror. So then you're left with a kind of noumenal, temporal, literal god, which I think is different to the kind of socio-political god. The Marxists are kind of worshipping their own conjecture, really.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's always been what's so exhilarating and brilliant about Nick's writing. The fact he does that is it's ravishing. It still works. It still blows your mind. It's like, and it was designed to do that. It was designed to overthrow all your ideas about what was going on with economics and reality and morality and the human security system, etc. And it's brilliant for that. It certainly turned my mind inside out. And I really enjoyed that. That's a kind of it's a pleasure to have your mind turned inside out.
Oh, actually, there is quite a relevant. Are you still good for time? Yeah. Yeah,
I've got a few more minutes.
There's a good transition here to one of the things that I mentioned to you about Mark, where he says about. So if we are to go from this kind of almost mad Marxist interpretation of capital. Mark Fisher says the one thing that this unnameable thing does allow us as a kind of atheological parasite is our flesh, and that flesh, this flesh is that's wherein the revolution can come from, which goes back once again to zombies. So I'm not sure how you see this.
No, yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've got a long list of words here that come together on a piece of paper that I scrambled down. But it brings together Burroughs and Ballard and the science fiction visions that Nick and Mark and Jameson were all very interested in. And I think one of the missing components here is addiction. So the virus addiction, which is Burroughs, it's something from outside takes control of your central nervous system, or it's in your cellular automata that is so deeply ingrained in us. It's like, I think we could safely say that Nick would probably say, I don't know if Mark, that, capitalism is in our DNA, or it hacks our DNA. And I think that's a really interesting and provocative and thought-provoking idea. I don't see it that way at all, because I don't have this idea of capital as an alien intelligence or a kind of vector of evolutionary momentum that is inevitably moving in a certain direction, which may be indifferent to the human species. Although I have no problem thinking that either. I always like the quote from Marshall McLuhan, who said, machines, the humans are the reproductive organs of the machine world. And I've got no problem with these thoughts, but I don't see us as the zombies because we're flesh and mortal and, going about our lives either oblivious to or controlled by an alien parasite. I just don't think that's what's going on. So
you somewhat agree with McLuhan's statement there that we're the organs of the machine, but
the reproductive organs of the machine world. I do understand that the technological evolution of that humans are implicated in is definitely something other than the human, no doubt about that.
There's still human there.
What's that?
Sorry, but there's still space for the human.
For the time being, I actually don't. I'm not so far from Nick and this thought. I think that things may evolve faster than we thought, and we'll see. People seem to be embracing the cyborgian, techno-commercial kind of fantasies and wanting them, and people are profoundly mimetic beings, and so I understand how it can seem that we are internalizing our technology in a kind of Cronenberg, Videodrome way. But once again, I think that once you cut the addiction and move into a different territory, it doesn't look like that. It doesn't seem like that. It seems like that if you're plugged in.
Okay, I haven't yet had someone, probably because I'm a little bit too plugged in myself, but I haven't had someone use the analogy of kind of you can unplug from this because that idea of the revered Marxist capital as God is so encompassing that you almost it's made in such a way that it wouldn't even matter if you tried to unplug. It's an extremely politically determinist thing.
Well, yeah, I've just been editing before we spoke. I attended a potlatch ceremony. I don't know if you know about potlatch, but it's something Bataille. The reason I attended a potlatch ceremony is because I read Bataille on potlatch in The Accursed Chair many years ago. And I thought that institution was a thing of the past. It was an archaic gift economy. But in fact, it isn't an archaic gift economy. It wasn't banned. Well, they tried to ban it. It's continued and it's resurgent. And so I'm currently, making an edit of that document, a document of that event. And it's too much to go into to get into that. But the mode of economy that First Nations people up in British Columbia are involved in is so different to this idea of an all-encompassing, inescapable logic of capital. That's not to say that they aren't plugged in some way and, using Instagram, but the dynamics of their cultural system is not operating at those speeds. And in fact, they're decelerating relative to the acceleration of techno-capitalism. And there are movements all over the place of unplugging, slowing down, decelerating, and also archaic traditions which just have never been part of that system, where the logic of exchange and trade and economy is simply not operating on those terms or on those platforms. So there is plenty going on the planet that isn't operating according to the accelerated logic of cybercapitalism. But you wouldn't know that if you were always on a computer.
Okay. So the accelerationists need to log off.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably a long overdue thing. But then what happens to the accelerationists when they log off? I mean,
they go, if they're really addicted, they'll go into some sort of cold turkey and start shaking and shivering, or like some vampires, needs its blood. And then if they manage to go through the withdrawal, which is probably like a bad case of flu, they might then start to take control of themselves and take responsibility for their destinies instead of handing it all over to a machine complex.
Yeah, this is completely in keeping with one of the things Michel Serres actually says in his latest in one of his latest works. I think he says that there's no space on the earth left anymore where one can find silence, and his idea of silence isn't technically as close to the traditional idea of silence. It's much closer to kind of an area that hasn't been infected by, I guess you say, globalized kind of corporatees, and it was something I disagreed with. I think there's plenty of places of silence. The difficulty is making sure your mind is clear of that stuff before you go there, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course, and that's a discipline.
Most definitely.
I mean, I think that's the other thing. To stop being an addict takes discipline. It takes practice, and there are lots of practices that have been evolved over many centuries to enable one to take better control of the mind-body relationship, etc. There's lots of ways it can be done. So you can break the addiction.
Okay. I'm not sure that the accelerationist sphere is going to be very happy about this.
Yeah.
Is there anything you
There's one final thing which I wanted to, we didn't talk too much about Bataille's philosophical influences, but one of the things that Michael Surya in his brilliant biography of Bataille talks about, and it's somebody that I think is worth looking at, and that's the influence of this Russian philosopher, Lev Chestov, sometimes called Leon Chestov, who Bataille hung around with in around 1921, 22, the early 20s in Paris. And this guy was a former communist, or he'd been a Bolshevik, or he'd been part of the revolution. He wrote on Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, and he was forced by the Bolsheviks to write a Marxist introduction to one of his books, and he refused to do it. And eventually he left the Soviet Union and ended up in Paris, where he was a huge influence on the recently de-Christianized Bataille, who was going through his phase of, finding God in brothels and in debauchery, which, of course, nothing against that. And it's interesting that Chestov had Dostoevsky and Nietzsche were the two key thinkers that then would become hugely influential in Bataille. And in Surya's biography, he ponders on why Bataille didn't acknowledge Chestov, who was a clearly profound influence on his thought, as much as other writers. And the conclusion, which Pierre Klosowski, in a different text, apparently says, is that the way out of atheism had to be communism. And there was nowhere else but Marxism for intellectuals of the 1920s to go. And the rejection of Christianity, the rejection of theism, which, of course, Bataille was hugely opposed to Christianity, and yet it clearly informed so much of his thinking, meant that he couldn't accept the position of Lev Chestov and his rejection of communism, because there seemed to be nowhere else to go but Marxism. So, and Bataille was never the most conventional of Marxists, let's face it. Yeah. But he went there because he couldn't face what Chestov was saying to him. So I think if you wanted to look at a philosopher and thinker who is kind of off the radar but hugely important, I think Lev Chestov is the person to look at.
That's an interesting position, because then Bataille is left in a that's a point of complete stagnation. If you're told the only place you can go is communism, and then you meet someone who's just come from there and who's saying, we can't go there. What are you left with there?
Well, that's right. I mean, the thing is, it's a bit like after the French Revolution and the creation of the anti-clericism that led to the creation of the idea of the supreme being. It's like, what do you put in the place of the death of God? And Bataille did put revolution in place of the death of God up until a certain point. In fact, up until the Second World War. And really, the Second World War was changed Bataille's thinking quite significantly, and the Cursed Chair came after that. He started thinking more about general economy, although it had already been there since the 1930s in his critique of the notion of expenditure. But yeah, I mean, we didn't get into the nuts and bolts and nitty-gritty of Bataille and general economics. But I think more important is this question of the conversion moment. I think this is what's interesting about Lev Chestov, because he wrote about conversion moments and what it is to lose faith, to go through the despair, and where you end up after that, and what happens when if you've been and this is why the red pill is so interesting. You know, what happens if for all your life you've believed in Marxism and, you know, the proletarian revolution, it's just a question of time and hard work and joining the Labour Party. And then you kind of raise, you know, that's a completely illusory. That's really not going to happen. What do you do then? And how you go through that, readjusting all of your thought and values to accommodate a new set of ideas and that go deeply against the grain of something you've kind of had become second nature in your soul almost. And I think this is fascinating. That's what interests me about neo-reaction too, that and the idea of being red-pilled, that, you know, that having your, you know, ideological, political faith turned inside out and eviscerated is always good.
I think they see that as the contemporary liberal progressivism is the default skin of anyone kind of in the West. So it's just what you do is tolerate and be democratic and equalize everything within sight. So once that initial default setting is someone kind of says, you know, you can do other things, it's you know, there's the red pill and where you go from that. But I think one of the initial problems there is that people tend to, you know, just do the opposite straight away and go into kind of you know, fascism and alt-right, which is, you know, ridiculous alt-right type stuff.
Yeah. That's so interesting. But it's the interesting. It's very great. It's very good to have your fundamental values significantly challenged and threatened at such a base level that, you know, they shake the foundations of your world, as, you know, Bataille did, and as Nick's book on Bataille did. You know, I think this is, you know, again, I might be ameliorating it in some ways, or like trying to, you know, soften the blow, which of course isn't, you know, could be seen as a liberal progressive absorption. But anyway, that's as it may be.
Okay, I think that's probably a good place to end. And unless there's any more,
great.
I mean, we didn't get into the nuts and bolts of Bataille, but I think, you know, Hermetics is fine with kind of, as long as ideas are flowing and things like that. It's completely what the podcast is after. So
great.